Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're continuing our series on the Chronicles of Narnia with this book today is Prince Caspian, and we have with us Joseph Pearce, who wrote the book further in, as well as many books on many different literary figures, including Shakespeare, and there's including also many just massive books on all the different Catholic literary figures, such as Tolkien, in multiple books. I think one of them's called the Literary Converts, as well as it's right next to me. Hold on. Literary Giants. That's what it is. Literary Converts and Literary Giants. But here we're talking about C.S. Lewis, who is not a Catholic, but you also wrote a book on C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church. Is that right?
Yes, I've written two books on C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and the Catholic Church, which is a sort of biography focusing on his relationship with Catholicism from his childhood right through to his death. And then the other book on C.S. Lewis is the one that's more directly connected to our discussion, and that's further up and further in Understanding Narnia. So I wrote a book on the Chronicles of Narnia. So they're my two books on Lewis. I've written three books on Tolkien. So I love the Inklings. I love Tolkien and Lewis.
And you can find his work also on his website, which is jpearce.co, right?
Yeah, jpearce.co, jpearce.co. If people want to keep up what I'm up to, I post new things on there every week. 3 new podcasts in the inner sanctum part of the website.
Awesome. So I think this Prince Caspian book might be one of the more confusing Narnia books for Americans, because we don't really have a good understanding of English history.
Well, yes, that's a good point, and it's a good question. Obviously, we understand reality better if we understand the multifaceted aspects of it. So what's true of reality is also true of literature, the reality presented to us in literature. And the more understanding we have of intertextual dimensions, in other words, the extent to which a work of literature points to things beyond the text, then that can be other texts, or it can be contexts such as history. And certainly in Prince Caspian, there's a lot of English history going on in the background. So, but one good thing, I think, part of the adventure of good literature, of great literature, is it leads us into other worlds, not just the other world of the work of fiction, but other worlds in terms of the past, both of our own country and of other people's countries. It broadens our perspective.
Yeah. So the premise of this book is that we have Narnia, which has been is gone through hundreds of years since the Pevensey children ruled, and the Pevenseys have basically only experienced a year in our world, and the Telmarines have come in to Narnia and have basically overthrown the old way, the old Narnia, and they sort of it was basically the Norman conquest in some ways, and the Pevenseys are called back into Narnia to answer the call from the old Narnians, and Prince Caspian has been raised to believe that he is not the heir to the throne, or actually no, he should be the king, but he believes that his uncle is the rightful king, and that seems a little bit Richard III.
Yeah, so there's lots going on there. You're completely correct to make the allusion to the Norman conquest. It has been centuries, although it only seems a year in our time, when the Pevensey children are called back to Narnia. They discover that it's actually centuries later. And again, there's some good, deep metaphysics going on here. Like when we die, for instance, how long do we have to hang around in the grave before the last day and we're raised up? it's really an academic question, because we're leaving the world of physics to the world of metaphysics, right? We're leaving the temporal into the eternal. So the point is that when we cross the threshold from the temporal life to the eternal life, it will be instantaneous. It doesn't matter whether we lived 10,000 years ago or 10,000 years in the future or last week. Basically, we will enter the presence of God at his will. So same thing here as what Lewis is getting at, is that Narnia is a different world. And as it's a different world, it's on a different, shall we say, temporal plane altogether. And we can spend no time here. And 1,000 years might have passed in Narnia. It's just on a different level of being. So when they go back hundreds of years, we're told that, obviously, you said Telmarines had invaded, and the first Telmarine ruler was King Caspian the First, who's also known as Caspian the Conqueror. And again, once you understand history, you see immediately the direct connection with William the First, the Norman conqueror, who's known as William the Conqueror. So clearly, Lewis is intending us to see the connection, to see the parallel between the two ages. So that means, if we want to take that parallel literally as well as literarily, that something like 900 years have passed since the time when King Peter and his siblings ruled in Narnia, and the time in which they are recalled to Narnia, and in the reign of the usurping wicked King Miraz, who's usurping the throne from his nephew, the true king Caspian.
Yeah, the way the book is structured is very interesting, because it starts with the kids, with Pevensies, and then switches to Prince Caspian, and then switches back to the kids. Well, do you think that was, or do you think that was a smart way of doing it? Because it definitely, when I first read it, it definitely like sort of just made it difficult to continue reading.
Well, I think there's a complexity there, and of course, especially if we read the Chronicles of Narnia for the first time when we're a child, or have them read to us as a child, then complexity can be perplexity, right? That which is complex can be perplexing. So, but I think the parallel stories that then converge as the Pevensey children actually arrive at Aslan's Howe and join the Crusaders in their uprising against the wicked King Miraz, and then the stories come together. I think literarily it's beautiful. But I do understand that that if we're used to a simple narrative, and children certainly are, that you just follow usually just one character and not multiple characters, one character and their story from the once upon a time to the living happily ever after. Then when you get these different literary techniques, parallel stories that converge, but that's part of growing up, right? That's part of learning to mature in our literary understanding of things. So that's exactly what the Chronicles of Narnia do. By the time we get to the last battle, it's a very dark work, and the final pages are very, very deep in terms of theology, but presumably and hopefully a child that's managed to get through the first 6 will be up to this new challenge, but nonetheless will be a challenge.
Yeah, I'm afraid that many adults wouldn't be patient enough in their literary capacity in some ways, because we have become childish in that way.
Yeah, I think that G.K. Chesterton said way back in the early 1920s that the coming peril was not Bolshevism, was not communism. The coming peril was standardization by a low standard. And I think this dumbing down a culture to a lowest common denominator of attention deficit disorder has been accelerated by technology. So it certainly is true that we live in an age of illiteracy that's largely caused by the fact that people are out of the habit of reading anything but snippets on social media, and they're agitated by distraction all the time. So again, that's another reason, by the way, if you actually want spiritual and psychological health, which is connected to physical health, they can't be separated. You need to find time. You need that disconnect from technology and find time to read books. Find time to read poetry, because poetry forces you to slow down. Watch a sunset. In other words, get in touch with reality by disconnecting from virtual reality, and you'll be a happier person. And you will find actually that you can read much better once you give yourself the time to do so.
Yeah, that's great advice. I really suggest everyone do that. As a Zoomer, it's definitely something have to overcome. Like it's something that I wasn't trained to do when I was a kid, that I have to overcome as an adult. And it just goes to show you, like, when you're raising your children, it's important to provide them that skill, basically.
Yes, it's important first of all to make sure your children are not addicted to gadgets. I sometimes say that gadgets should be called godgets, because we spend more time with our gadgets than we do with our God. We certainly, an important part of parenting is to limit the amount of time that our children have with technology, and to maximize the amount of time that they have with good, nurturing and nourishing activities such as reading good books.
Hmm. So we've talked about sort of the fact that there's an old Narnia, but there's also in the real world that there's talk a lot about Old England. What are the similarities between old Narnia and Old England?
Yeah, again, another parallel is connected once again to the Norman conquest, which is clearly quite a key motif in this book. For Tolkien and Lewis, for both of them, and we need to remember that they were good friends. They were both Oxford professors at the same time in the 1920s, right through to their retirement in the 60s. They were both lovers of Old English. The Old English is the language which precedes the Norman conquest, sometimes called Anglo-Saxon. And the period of Anglo-Saxondom, the period of Anglo-Saxon England, which from the point of view of its being Christian, certainly dates from the arrival of, it gets complicated, but from the arrival of St. Augustine of Canterbury, whose feast day we celebrated a couple of days ago, at the end of the 500s, the end of the 6th century, towards the end of the 11th. So for almost 5 years, there's this golden age of Christendom called Anglo-Saxondom, and the great works from that period, such as Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon epic, which was hugely influential on Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien even translated it. Some great Anglo-Saxon poetry. We have St. Bede the Venerable with his ecclesiastical history of the English people from that time. We have great English Anglo-Saxon missionaries going out, such as St. Boniface, and converting the Germanic tribes of Europe. So this was a golden age. So I think that what's being alluded to in Prince Caspian is that the old Narnia, it was a healthier place. That somehow this old world of the Shire. I mean, again, we do need to realise that Tolkien's depiction of the Shire is also rooted in Anglo-Saxondom. That this old world of the Shire had basically been compromised and well, up to a point, destroyed by this conquest. So there's now only a remnant of the old Narnians living, in the hinterlands, on the edges of things, away from the cities, and reminding us, in fact, in their lifestyle of perhaps Robin Hood. And again, Robin Hood is a character who evokes the old Anglo-Saxon England, the Merry England. So we have this elusive parallel with English history going on in Prince Caspian.
Okay, gotcha. Now, I knew Tolkien had a great love of Anglo-Saxon, and I wasn't really sure. I didn't really know that C.S. Lewis did as well. But like Hilaire Belloc, he was much more of a Norman admirer. So, how do you or I don't know, what's the right balance, I guess?
Well, that's a great question. Again, there's a wonderful story that was told in the memoirs of Father Martin Darcy, who's a Jesuit from the time between the two world wars, a very well-known figure at the time, who was known, who knew both Belloc and Tolkien, and in his memoir and his biography, Father Darcy talks about attending a lecture in Oxford given by Hilaire Belloc, in which Belloc basically says that the Norman conquest was a good thing for England because it brought England into the fullness of European Christendom. And of course, Belloc is very much a Francophile. I mean, he's half French, born in France. His father was French. And so he loves France. France is the oldest order of the church, and he sees things from a French perspective. But as Father Darcy is watching this lecture and listening to this lecture, that Tolkien is in the audience just in front of him, and Father Darcy is watching Tolkien getting more and more irritated and irate at Belloc's line of reasoning. So yes, you're completely correct. There are two ways of perceiving the Norman conquest and of the Anglo-Saxon England which preceded it. All I would say is that my sympathies are very, very strongly with Tolkien. I love Belloc. I mean, I've written a biography of Belloc as well, and I love. He's one of my favorite writers. I see him as a friend, in fact. But on this, I disagree with my friend. Because there was the Anglo-Saxon England was already an integral part of Christendom. You could even and there was a book once called "How the Irish Saved Civilization," about the likes of St. Patrick and the Irish missionaries that went out. But you could write a book. Someone could write a book. Perhaps someone should write a book called "How the English Saved Civilization," and that would be again about the golden age of Christendom, which was Anglo-Saxon England, which included the sending out of missionaries such as Saint Boniface. It included Alcuin, this great teacher of Charlemagne of the Holy Roman Empire, who basically brought, should we say, the learned world of philosophical and theological Catholicism to the whole of Europe. But he was from York in northern England. So Parce, Belloc, all peace to Belloc, that Anglo-Saxon England did not need the Norman conquest to become a fully fledged Catholic nation. Anglo-Saxon England was already a fully fledged Catholic nation.
Mm. Did Father Darcy also bring law into the church?
Yes, I believe he did at Father Darcy's church, which is a Church of the Immaculate Conception, the Jesuit church in Mayfair in London. I believe that's exactly the war was received in the church there. Yes, and perhaps the poet Edith Sitwell, if my memory serves me correctly, also.
Okay, yeah. I thought I recognized the name, but I wasn't totally sure.
Yeah, especially if those of your viewers that know these things, that the character of Father Mowbray in Evening War's novel Brideshead Revisited is modelled on Father Martin Darcy.
Yeah. So back to sort of Caspian, he's being educated by his tutor. Well, first he's has his nanny, and his nanny is shuffled away because she's telling him stories of the old Narnia, and then the tutor also is explicitly told not to teach him basically the old Narnian history. It reminds me reminds me of Whig history. Is that
Yes.
what Lewis is referring to?
Well, we have to be careful with Lewis, of course, because Lewis is a Northern Ireland Protestant. That Hilaire Belloc, of course, wrote a multi-volume history of England, which he stated explicitly was to counter the Tom Fall Protestant history. The Whig history basically is history written by the victors to justify their own misdemeanors. So it's outrageous. It airbrushes out all the wicked things that the Whigs did, and rewrites English history in accordance with their victors' philosophy. So certainly what Lewis is saying there is that, I mean, we might say more about the fact that legends that we mustn't trust legends. I mean, this would be much more in line with Lewis. So I agree with you about the Whig history. It's absolutely applicable, and it may well have been in Lewis's mind. But I think that we need to have an element of caution there. But what's certainly true is that he believed that stories that were legends are not lies. Right, that myths convey truths, and of course, what we find out in Prince Caspian, that all of these legends that the Prince Caspian and the people of Narnia have been told to distrust are actually true. So, and this would be the case, of course. Again, it's like the Whigs, because the Telmarines, right, have to justify the fact that they invaded someone else's country, that they took over, and that they imposed their ultimately usurping will upon the indigenous people. So, you know, that could apply to the Norman conquest. It certainly could apply to the Tudor tyranny, where the faith of the English people was ripped away from them against their will by Henry VIII. It could certainly apply to the so-called Glorious Revolution, when the true King of England was overthrown by basically the rich and the wealthy in 1688. So there's absolutely, there are elements of this that are applicable to reality. I mean, as Tolkien and Lewis say, that a story has applicability. There are things within the story that can be applied to things beyond the story, and specifically and especially to things in our own world.
Yeah. So the Caspian learns that everything, that the sort of old Narnians are real. He also learns that his uncle has a son, and now he needs to be done away with. So he is escorted out of the castle by his tutor, and he basically runs into the Narnians, the old Narnians, and becomes the leader of the old Narnians. In your book, further up and further in, it makes a lot of references to the Jacobite kings, and it reminds me a little bit of how also the Stuarts were Scottish, and they became kings of England and Scotland, and then they sort of and then they become the leaders of this Jacobitism. So, is that something being referenced as well?
Yeah, there's a recurring motif in both Tolkien and Lewis of the return of the king. Obviously, that's one of the parts of Lord of the Rings is the return of the king, but we see it in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? That everyone's awaiting the return of Aslan. You know, so that this curse of the winter that's never Christmas, that's been imposed upon the people of Narnia by the White Witch, may pass when Aslan returns, right? Aslan's on the move, the return of the king. So this motif's already established in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so we see it again. And the return of the king within an English context, it normally evokes both the Jacobite, so you're correct, and just for those of your viewers that don't know much about English and Scottish history, that basically the King James II was the true King of England. Nobody at all is disputing that. So he becomes King of England. But James II is a Catholic, and the Catholic monarchy had been overthrown 150 years earlier, effectively, when Henry VIII sets up a state religion. And by this time, of course, a lot of people have become very rich because of the parceling out of the church land, the monasteries and what have you, been handed out to the new aristocracy. And there's also a new mercantile class, a class of very wealthy merchants. And these people do not want a return to Catholicism. So they pay, and this is one of the great acts of treachery in history, which again, the Whigs call a glorious revolution. So they admit it's a revolution, right? They're not saying true king, we put a true king on the throne. No, we removed the true king, we had a revolution, but it was a glorious revolution. Well, what was glorious about it? These super wealthy people and politicians paid for an army of foreign mercenaries to invade their own country. Now, I can't think of anything which is more treacherous to your own country than to pay a foreign army to invade it. That's basically what happened. And so King James II, the true king, is forced into exile. he has a campaign in Ireland to try to come back to the throne, and that fails. And then his ancestors lead to Jacobite uprisings. And the Latin Jacobus means James. So a Jacobite is a follower of James. That's where the names come from. So there's this Jacobite longing for the return of the true king, the king who's in exile over the water, awaiting his return. But the other dimension, which is very important, and perhaps even more important that for Lewis, is the Arthurian dimension, King Arthur. Because King Arthur is the once and future king. So he was king once, but when things get really bad, he will return and deliver England from her enemies. So again, Arthur's the once and future king. The Jacobite king is a king in exile. We await the return of the king. And of course, for a Christian, and of course, it's perilous to forget that C.S. Lewis is a Christian, we are all of us always awaiting the return of the king himself, Christ the King.
It seems that sort of in some ways the Caspian represents kind of the Jacobite kings, and then the Pevensies in some ways represent Arthur, because they're coming from the past from a Narnian perspective, and Caspian is not one of them in sort of the in some sense, but also their leader who has been exiled.
You're completely correct. The Pevensies, because they've returned after centuries, let's say 900 years away. Arthur would be even longer. But either way, you're completely correct that there is an Arthurian dimension to the return of the Pevensey children, the old kings and queens who passed away, who have they left, right? Imagine all sorts of legends that arise in Narnia to these the two kings and two queens that sort of just rule for a long while and then sort of disappear. And then they return centuries later. So of course there's an Arthurian dimension to it, which we mustn't forget. Now, Prince Caspian as the Jacobite king, yes, but it gets very complex and complicated there, because of course, the Prince Caspian is the heir of King Caspian the First. So he's the heir of the invading Telmarines. That's why he's human and not a talking beast.
Mm-hmm.
Not a true Narnian, an old Narnian, shall we say? He's a new Narnian. We can't overforce it, but
Sure.
certainly in the sense that that the king in power, Miraz, is a usurper, as was William III, the person who replaced James II, as a usurper. So the fact that we have a usurper on the throne and the true king is trying to restore the crown that's rightfully his, yes, absolutely. In that sense, King Caspian, Prince Caspian, later King Caspian, is a Jacobite.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that it's like can be imprinted on. Like, I don't mean to say that it's like almost like exactly what happened. But it does it just makes me think about that. It makes me harken back to that. It seems, we're talking about Lewis. He's often longing, it seems, for something in his Narnia books. Because he's often bad mouthing the education of the current time. He is using this sort of Arthurian references, as well as some Jacobite in maybe accidental and not purposeful. But because he never became a Catholic, it seems like, does he know what he's longing for in some ways? Did Lewis know?
Well, yeah, again, that's another great question. You asked lots of good questions. Lewis, again, I wrote a book called C.S. Lewis in the Catholic Church. It's about 65,000 words, so it's always a bit of a challenge to try to answer a question about Lewis's religious position in a nutshell, in a soundbite. But what we need to understand is that Lewis, the Jacobite issue, he may have been conflicted on, because certainly the people of the Protestants in Northern Ireland, there's a very powerful secret society in Northern Ireland called the Orange Order, named after William of Orange, the usurping King William III, who replaced the true King James II. And there's no doubt at all that Lewis and his brother Warney were, in some sense, impacted by that Orangism. So I do think there'll be an element of ambivalence. But nonetheless, Lewis was a good scholar and a learned man, and was sufficiently detached to imbibe. As I said, he loved the finishes of novels of Sir Walter Scott, some of which are very Jacobite. So he could certainly use the idea of the Jacobite as something which it can romantically move his story forward, with the idea of the return of the king, not just in the Arthurian sense, but in the Jacobite sense. So, he's a very widely read, learned, and in a healthy sense, detached. In other words, he can look at ideas and take them in a detached fashion and apply them to his own work. And you're completely correct that Lewis and Tolkien don't write formal allegories. We're not meant to say that in fact, it would be wrong to say that Prince Caspian is a Jacobite. No, he's not a Jacobite, but he reminds us of the Jacobites, and is meant to. There's an applicability rather than a direct, hard, formal, allegorical connection.
Yeah. It's just interesting because Lewis is really he's a critic of the modern world. So it's just very interesting to see how he critiques the modern world in his fiction.
Yes, that's one of the things that's applicable about it. So it's set in another world, in another time, in a sort of quasi medieval culture that's very low tech or no tech. And yet, of course, what he's saying, what he's doing in terms of theology, philosophy, political applicability is very relevant and pertinent to the real world in which he lived, right? And indeed to the world in which we live a century after him, or 75 years after him, or what have you. So that's the genius of a storyteller, because the stories reflect reality. They show us the world in which we live, and as G.K. Chesterton says in Orthodoxy, in the chapter on the ethics of Elfland, he says that fairy stories don't just show us how things are; they show us how things ought to be. He says that it's not earth that judges heaven; it's heaven that judges the earth, and therefore it's not earth that judges fairyland; it's fairyland that judges the earth. So, in other words, when we enter Narnia, we actually are allowed to enter in a position of judgment upon our own world, because it's showing us the way things should be in our world, the way things are in our world, and the way things shouldn't be in our world. It's a magic mirror that shows us not just the physical realities, but the metaphysical realities.
Yeah. Now, Aslan and Caspian don't interact that much, obviously, in the very beginning of the story, and it's interesting because Caspian in the beginning really has the relationship we have with God. We're not physically present with our Lord. We're not seeing him walk about. But the Pevensies, on the other hand, have done so with Aslan. They have walked about with Aslan. So it's most interesting that they are the most sort of impatient and struggling as they make their way through Narnia. They do not they are in a lot of ways sort of doubting Thomas in the story.
Yeah, I'm very pleased you brought that up, because I think it's one of the most important elements of the story. It's rooted. It's a meditation, a very deep meditation on the nature of faith, and basically they can't see him. That's the whole point, right? They have been able to see him in the past, but now they can't. Now, he appears first of all to Lucy. There's a hierarchy of perception here, right? Lucy, of course, as we've discussed in the earlier episodes, Lucy, her name comes from the Latin lux, which means light. Saint Lucy is the patron saint of the blind. Lucy is the seer, right? She's the one who sees most and first, not only in the Lion, Witch and Wardrobe, but in Prince Caspian. She's the one who can first see Aslan, but then the others can't. So for the others, they have to either think that Lucy is lying, and we know that Lucy is not a liar, so there's no real excuse for that perspective. But nonetheless, they can't see what she's seeing. They have to take what she's seeing on faith. And it's very interesting there. The first person to accept what she's saying on faith is Edmund. And Edmund, of course, is the prodigal son figure from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Right? He's the sinner, the repentant sinner. And so for him, he knows that he has failed Lucy in the past by refusing to believe her. And if you like, as an act of penance, says, look, I'm not going to doubt her again. I doubted her once before, and that didn't end well. I'm going to believe her, even though I can't see. And then once he makes the act of faith, he can see. In other words, once he makes his act of faith in Aslan, Aslan then becomes visible. And then Peter can see eventually, and then finally Susan, who's very repentant and apologetic for her lack of faith. And that's actually a premonition, as we of what we learn about her in the last battle, but perhaps we won't speak about that now. So for me, it's a very profound meditation upon the nature of faith. Are we able to believe things that physically we can't see? To me, it's one of the deepest spiritual elements of not just Prince Caspian, but all of the Chronicles of Narnia. That particular part of the story where they are learning to see with eyes of faith.
Yeah. One of the fruits of the Holy Spirit is something that I did not really know very well until very recently, which is longanimity. And I think it is the importance of it is placed at the center of the story. Our desire for Christ to sort of come in and fix everything when we want it to happen. And the old Narnians have to be patient and also have to experience that, and some are and some aren't. You have Nickabrick, who is the least patient. I mean, he basically turns to the demonic, the occult, in response to that. And that is one of the difficulties in society, is so many people have decided, I'm tired of whatever is their problem in this world. They're tired of waiting. They're tired of, they don't have these virtues, and they want to overturn things, overturn the world. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think your reference to longanimity is very good. The perseverance in faith. This is the real test. That's the whole point. Is that God is not a magician. He doesn't offer instantaneous results at our beck and call. He's not our servant or slave. We are his servants, not his slaves, but we are his servants. We're meant to be. We are free to refuse to be his servants, which is why we're not slaves. But the difference here, the important thing about this is that, again, in Tolkien and Lewis, the temptation to magic or the occult, the temptation that Knickerbook falls into in Prince Caspian is, no, if we can take some supernatural power or some natural power, such as technology, and deliver ourselves into what we want now, rather than having to have longanimity, rather than having to have endurance and patience, perseverance, then that's a temptation. And again, it's the temptation to pluck the apple, right? Is that they choose the knowledge of good and evil, and they already had knowledge of the good. so choosing to pluck the apple was choosing the knowledge of evil, right? Choosing to know evil. And so sometimes, in order to get what we want, again, the buzz phrase from the time of Nietzsche onwards, and it's certainly the buzz phrase in our pride-oriented culture, is self-empowerment. right? And if it's all about self-empowerment, then you find some way to empower the self, and whatever is the most easy and self-gratifying way of doing that. So use technology, so should we say material magic, or use the demonic, supernatural magic, both of which that technology is itself is neutral, but using it pridefully, as using anything pridefully, is sinful.
Gotcha. Yeah, the one of the interesting things also about the story is that as the Pevensey spend more time in Narnia, they are sort of brought into their own, back to their abilities, back to their skills, back to their knowledge of their time when they were in Narnia, so much that by sort of the time when Peter makes it to Caspian and they're prepared to duel with Miraz, he is talking like an ancient king. So
Yeah, and
where does that
there's
come from?
another very important point you make, because what can happen to us, and this is particularly, it's important for all of us because we're all called to remain childlike, but it's especially important for children that are growing up and needing to grow into maturity, and maturity being ultimately to grow in virtue, that we can enter another world than the world in which we find ourselves, as the Pevensey children do in entering Narnia. And in entering that world, we can be ennobled. We can learn to live vicariously, because we can't do it physically in our own circumstance, especially if we're a 10-year-old living at home with our parents, right? But we can learn to live vicariously the life of courage, of fortitude, of faith, of perseverance. So that's what really happens. What happens within the story. But in entering Narnia, the Pevensey children are no longer merely children living in 1940s England. They are called to something greater, and I think that's one of the glories of great literature, and especially the literature of Narnia and Middle Earth, that it calls us to greatness. Right? We're not meant to be spectators. We enter the story ourselves. We walk the journey with Bilbo or Frodo. We take the journey with the Pevensey children from Cair Paravel to Aslan's Howe. We are meant to be there, and we are meant to, if you like, be vicariously sharing in the nobility, the ennoblement that's being offered to us in the reading of the story. When we open the pages of one of the Chronicles of Narnia, is like walking through a wardrobe. We are literally crossing the threshold into another world where we are called to grow up.
Yeah. And sort of one of the last things that I want to discuss is sort of this. There's a weirder part that happens when Aslan when he triumphs, when he and Susan and Lucy sort of march in this parade, and he goes and brings the faithful out of hiding and stuff like that. Now there's a character, Bacchus. Now my understanding is that that's what is it? The Isn't that the god of wine from
Yes.
Greek mythology? Can you explain
Yes.
why Lewis brings Bacchus into the story, and what are we supposed to make of that?
Yeah, that's yeah. You certainly do ask some great questions, Connor. It's a joy to converse with you, because that an interview is only as good as the questions one's asked. So what we have to understand about C.S. Lewis is his understanding of the true paganism, and by true paganism we mean that paganism which existed before the time of Christ. Now, the paganism before the time of Christ is not culpable for being pagan, right? Because it has not had the fullness of Christian truth revealed to it. The revelation has not happened. So they're groping in the dark. So, for instance, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Pilgrim's Regress, we meet a character called Father History. And Father History says basically that right back in the eons of time, right back at the beginning of time, the landlord, which is the name for God in that story, the landlord there was a sundering of the landlord's people from the landlord. In other words, people turned their back on God. Only the landlord's own people, the Jews, remembered how to read. But God, the landlord, did not desert the vast bulk of people, the Gentiles, who had forgotten how to read. And because they'd forgotten how to read, they did not know the law, they did not know true theology, they did not have the covenant. He sent them pictures. In other words, that God spoke to his people that had strayed away from him with pictures. And this is very much Tolkien's and Lewis's philosophy of myth. Right? The love of wisdom could be found through story. So in the pagan culture, in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, in the Aeneid, in the tragedies of Sophocles, we see God revealing himself through wisdom in the telling of stories. So Lewis says that there's a big difference between the old pagans, Bacchus, that's what's being in this story. Bacchus is this old, healthy paganism which is being raised by Aslan and therefore baptized. All right. So what do Christians do? Well, the greatest work of Christian literature is probably the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy's inspiration comes from Virgil, the Aeneid, which is a work of pagan literature. Virgil takes his inspiration from Homer, which is Greek pagan literature. So we have this continuum. And as regards philosophy, that St. Augustine baptizes Plato. St. Thomas Aquinas baptizes Aristotle. So what happens is that Christendom baptizes all that's good in true paganism. So what Lewis says is that the old pagans were like the bride awaiting the coming of the bridegroom. He said the new pagans, the neo-pagans of our own day, are like divorcees that have walked away from the marriage. So the difference between the bride awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, the old pagan culture awaiting the coming of Christ, Bacchus, right? The spirit of joy, the joie de vivre, the rambunctiousness, that should be part of the Christian life. That's God of wine. It needs to be baptized and lifted up, and that's exactly what happens at the end of Prince Caspian.
Okay, yeah, that's great to know. Though I made a mistake, that wasn't the last thing I wanted to ask. The last thing I want to ask is I've heard it said that the book is about the corruption of the church and the purification of it. What do you think of that premise?
At best, it's an oversimplification and a reductionism. At worst, it's just wrong. I think what we've done here is discuss the multifaceted aspects of it. It's certainly an allusion to a culture that's become agnostic, that's forgotten its past. These are the new Narnians, okay, under Telmarine rule. That they've forgotten their past, therefore they've forgotten who they are, and that will of course include the true religion. They've lost the memory of Aslan. He's sort of some pagan myth. He's like Bacchus, right? He's not anybody real. He's sort of some legend that the superstitious people of the past. So in that sense, it's certainly a critique of modernity. And the agnosticism that's been the consequence of modernity, particularly the ideas of the Enlightenment and the skepticism that goes with it. So in that sense, yes, but it's a very broad understanding of the church in that case. In other words, it's Christendom as being something which is that we've forgotten and need to rediscover. In that sense, yes. But if you're talking about something that's to do with, within the church, then there's very little overt ecclesiological symbolism in the story. So I think that could be overstated.
Yeah, I think it came from a Protestant, so that might have been. It makes sense, sort of if it's coming from a Protestant perspective, the idea that they're sort of rediscovering that and that the church isn't specifically that ecclesial, like because
Right.
they don't necessarily have that view. I mean, some
Yeah, I think
do.
it would be very Protestant, basically, that that the whole idea of Aslan, died with the rise of Constantine, and then we had this early old Narnian church that was the old pure church, then becomes decadent and decayed, and then 1,000 years later there's this renewal which could be seen as the Reformation. I don't see that's what's happening in the story at all. I don't think that's what Lewis is talking about, but I can see why someone could read that into it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. It had been it had been something on my mind for a couple years, and it's good to have more clarity on that. We talked a little bit about your website is the perfect place to find your work. Is there anything else coming up that that's going on with you? I know you're teaching a summer class at I can't remember what school it is. Uh,
Yeah, there's always lots going on. I can't remember either. Next week I'm beginning a 5-week course with Memorial College online on Shakespeare. I'm leading a Camino in the company of Tolkien in Spain in September. So I'll be giving talks on Tolkien as we walk the Camino to Santiago de Compostela. So that's exciting. And I've got a new book coming out sometime later in the summer, early autumn. That's called The Good, the Bad, and the Beautiful: A History of Christendom in 3 Dimensions, which has one chapter for every century since the time of Christ. So I'm
oh
excited by
wow.
that. And yes, I would encourage your viewers to check out my website. If they want to know what I'm up to on a weekly basis, that's where to go. And that's jpearce.co, jpearce.co.
Awesome. That book is I'm very excited about that. I have your book on English history as well that I need to read as well by Ignatius Press. I'll have a link to that in this description if anybody wants to get that. But your work has just been so helpful, and I really appreciate you coming on to the show and talking to me about all the Narnia books. It's really a pleasure.
Well, it's my pleasure, Con. As I said, that I enjoy interviews in direct proportion to how good the interviewer is. So I always have a good time with you. You're knowledgeable. You ask the right sort of questions, and hopefully that's going to be something which is informative and entertaining for your viewers.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You're very kind and generous, it speaks to how good of a writer you are, your work, as well as just your virtue as well. So thank you for that.
Thank
Um,
you. God bless.
and yeah, everyone, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And God bless. Bye.